Hello, this is Hushank Amir Ahmadi, a distinguished service professor and president of the American Iranian Council. In today's video, I will share my perspectives on American capitalism and its post-corona situation. Although America did not really invented capitalism, it perfected it. It perfected both capitalism and liberalism. And in fact, liberal capitalism found a great home in this country of America. But just like in other areas, American capitalism has evolved over time. So has its liberalism. And we are now in a place where there is very little left of what American liberal capitalism used to be. A capitalism of serious competition. Not monopolies, not oligopolies, not huge firms, trusts, cartels, and so on. Not so much inequality across social classes, and not also so much diverse in cultural terms. Although America has always been the home to immigration. It is an immigrant country. But then again, the kind of immigrants that we have today is very different from what the America had 100 years ago. They used to be European. Now they are Spanish, they are Middle Eastern, they are Asian, and they are Africans, and you name it. And America used to be a melting pot of all of these people, but that capability has also to some extent been lost. That there are communities that see themselves more in favor of their own national identity and origin than their Americanism. That's unfortunate. But the fact of the matter is that that development also went alongside with the evolution of American liberal capitalism. American liberal capitalism has, over the last 100, probably 50 years, gradually moved from commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism, and then gradually to a new corporate capitalism that is dominated now by information technology. I say the corporate life is dominated by technology as opposed to technology being dominated by the companies. I believe in it. In the previous video, I explained how human beings, companies, states, individuals have become really dominated, a victim of our own progress, the human progress, and the way we have used the nature, we have produced the nature towards our needs and wants, and then in the process, we have created all kinds of problems, including this corona. American capitalism in the last almost 30 years has been in a very volatile situation. from, to be exact, perhaps 1971 or 70s, when America became sort of like a place where capitalism wasn't just the melting pot, it wasn't just a liberal, it just wasn't the competition, it was everything. American capitalism, but at the same time, continued to be, and particularly was, very productive, probably one of the most productive capitalist system on the earth, and that was American capitalism. American capitalism survived the Cold War, defeated the communists and the socialists and so on, and even claimed the end of ideology that the liberal capitalism is the way to go, and that kind of stuff. That was a time, no longer anybody likes even to talk about the end of history, the end of ideology, or the triumph of liberal capitalism in this country. Unfortunately, as capitalism evolved from a very productive and competitive system to less productive and monopolistic one, the political system simultaneously and along the side also changed significantly, producing increasingly less capable leaders, political leaders, and more corruptions, which has become a worldwide issue anyway. But I wanted today to focus on a different thing, and that is what is happening to American capitalism in its relation to capitalism elsewhere, Japanese, Chinese, Europeans, and the rest. That is how America is doing in relation to global competition that now it faces. I said that capitalism, because of the competition that is built in it, is the most productive system, and it is the system that created tremendous science and technology globally, but particularly in the US. America, until recently, and perhaps even today, was and is perhaps the leader in global scientific and technological advancement. And of course, America is the largest economy in the world, and it also has the largest army, the most powerful country on the earth. So America still is number one. But can America stay number one? That's what we're going to talk. Well, as I said, American capitalism created a world completely different from the world of capitalism everywhere in this globe. Europe, China, Japan, everywhere else. America produced science and technology as no other nation. American universities certainly were in the forefront of technological advancement. Technologies also grow from that science. America was the first probably country that truly mastered nature. No country has ever mastered nature the way America did. through science and technology. But I explained this the last time, so I don't want to take your time for it again. Through advancement of science and technology, America got deeper and deeper into the natural world, as well as the produced world out of nature, both the nature one and the nature two, the produced nature, creating greatest city, some of the greatest cities, not just in terms of the size, but in terms of what they offer. It's probably one of the most advanced countries in the world when it comes to urbanization and suburbanization. But in whichever way you look at it, America was doing great. But there was one big problem that America was facing, but it didn't notice. And perhaps its leaders, political leaders, missed it, as well as perhaps its economic leaders. And that was a simple fact that America would produce the most advanced sciences and technologies, but it will not control these developments and let them flow beyond America border. American great universities will produce the science and technology, and particularly sciences. But these innovations, inventions, and the rest will be taken by other nations, made into commercial something, and then used against us in their competition. Where America failed, perhaps, was to commercialize its science and technology. We just weren't thinking about it. Basic science was the way we wanted to go, and we did, and we perfected it, although we are still, as I said the last time, in the prehistory of technological and scientific development. But that's a different story. That is true of everywhere for the human being as a whole. So America produced all these advanced sciences and technologies, but did not control them. They spilled over the American borders to other countries who used these sciences and technologies, that is, they commercialized and used them in economics in their competition against us, and somehow created trouble for us in America. Now, there was a time that nobody could even think taking over America. That goes back like 50 years ago, in 50s and 60s. And then there came a time when Japan began rising. And there was discussions about, wow, Japan may soon take over America. Well, there were lots of concern about it. The American did some work on it to make sure that Japan doesn't succeed to become number one. But Japan did not, and indeed could not, for a number of reasons. First, Japan wasn't as big as America, was much smaller, both in geography and population. Second, Japan didn't have the resources, the natural resources that America has. It was a resource poor nation. In fact, the one resource the Japanese had was what they had taken from America, the spill over from America that they used to create all kinds of industries, electronics in particular. But the Japanese didn't have that base to defeat America, to become number one. In terms of population, material, scientific development, technological, they were not sort of like the innovators, the inventors. They were the users, they were the commercializers. But there came to a point where Japan stopped. But Japan simply didn't stop because it failed to produce technology or science, or its people weren't intelligent enough. That's not the case. Japan basically lost to America because increasingly Japan became like America. Let me explain. When Japan started to become a giant, it wasn't a democratic country. It was a state capitalism. It was a sort of a semi-dictatorship. It was very controlled. The government would dictate what the private sector should or should not do. It was in charge. And Japan had preserved certain level of its own traditionalism, culture, nativism and the rest. But Japan increasingly became like America. The American mass culture went with the American science and technology to Japan. But at the same time, Japan increasingly became like a liberal and then a new liberal capitalist, as away from state capitalism, from some level of semi-dictatorship, controlling agent or country, into a bit more liberal, open. The first time I went to Japan was probably 15 years, 16, no more, about 20 years ago. And in Tokyo, I didn't see anything different there that we didn't have it in the US. The Tokyo's bars were all like American bars. The kids were like American kids. And their economic system, their big companies were like American companies. They had become like Americans in terms of economy and politics, as well as culture. I think it was there that Japan lost. The more Japan became like America, the less it became capable to compete, because it just didn't have what America had. It had advanced because it was a different system. It was state-controlled in every respect. But then it became like America. It lost control. And the companies became like what we call global, multinationals, and so on. And therefore, their capitalism very quickly, what I say, matured. And that maturation led to their gradual decline, because they didn't have much of a space. Their space was global. But that global space wasn't always open to them all the time. There were new competitors in the market emerging from all over. From US was there, China, Europe, South Korea, Brazil, India, and gradually Japanese became one of many. So Japan failed to take on America, and America stayed number one. In most recent years, in the last decade, probably last 15, 20 years, as Japan disappeared as the one competitor, one big rival to America, China gradually rose up. China became a serious competitor, a major player globally. But China wasn't Japan, and it wasn't America, and it didn't become America like Japan became. China stayed at some level of its own Chinese identity and kept going with a system that did resemble American system, but it really wasn't. For example, American capitalism is a private capitalism. All of these huge companies are private. The state, Washington, has very little control over them. But many of the huge Chinese companies all over the world, they are state-owned. They look like private. They are made into private entities, but they are controlled by the state. Many of them are owned by the state, very few by non-state entities. Even there is a mix. So, first thing, Chinese state, where they were, with socialism, but developed within socialism something close to American capitalism. So the China gradually moved toward America in terms of capitalism, but it always stayed at its border, the socialist border, the Communist Party border. So it wasn't like what happened to Japan. China didn't open to liberalism. It did not accept or adopted liberal capitalism or even worse, new liberal capitalism. We just didn't. But what made or what makes China very dangerous to American way of life and to American, being number one, is the fact that Chinese are huge. China has almost over 4 times the population of America. Over 4. It's an extremely resourceful country. It's not like Japan, resource poor, it's resource rich. And it's very nationalistic. It has really maintained that traditionalism. In the last 30 years, China has moved from really 1 to 10. Huge, incredible. At the same time, China did not become like America. Interestingly, one thing that China also did was that it didn't invest in the beginning in outside its borders. It invited outsiders to come home to China to invest there. So Chinese got the Western, the American money in, capital in, technology in, science in, but gave very little out to them. That was a strategy. They did well on that. So it was a one-way street until recently. And even after, when Chinese began expanding globally in the other direction, from the direction of China out, they really went to other places than America and Europe or Japan. I mean, again, of course, they are everywhere, but they targeted developing countries, Middle East, Africa, Asia, and so many other countries. So Chinese, therefore, have a special situation that makes it dangerous to America. It's big, resource rich, big in terms of population, resource rich, and it's also in control. You have the Communist Party. It's a socialist, what I would call the socialist capitalism, maybe socialist capitalism or social capitalism, but it is the social part that controls. The capitalist part works. The capitalist work is the labor, and the social part is the capitalist, the capital, is the controller. Now, this China has already become second to America in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity. In fact, China is number one now economically, but in a regular GMP measure, it's still way behind America. But it is increasingly, growingly advancing. And this is particularly the case when America hasn't been advancing, and that American capitalism has been experiencing periodic crises. The last one was in 2008, and then now we are already in the next one with this coronavirus. Because Chinese capitalism is a little bit different, controlled, even if it experienced periodic volatile situation, crisis you may call, but it has been very quickly cured, controlled. So I fear China in terms of just competition. Otherwise, China's are good people, great people. Now, my fear is not, I don't want to say fear in terms of like, global competition or something beyond economic. And what I am talking about, Chinese, I fear that they will become number one. They will advance tremendously in science and technology very soon. They already are. And they can better manage crises that are ahead of us and ahead of them. This coronavirus was a good case. It was a showcase that it started in China, it died in China, and then we got hit big time and suffered most in the world. Well, again, this is America. This is American capitalism. This is the capitalism of monopolies, the capitalism of federalism, the capitalism of liberalism, of Democrats and conservatives and all kinds of stuff. President Trump could not even make the governor of New Jersey or New York, for that matter, to close its borders. Simply said no. The president had to say, okay, I obey. That's what federalism is. And that's where America is crippled. America is going to be crippled by its federalism, by its democratic system, by its monopoly capitalism. Period. And monopoly capitalism that is not in the hands of the state, it's the hands of the private sector. Now, here is the problem. The private sector is private sector. It goes after its own interest, not the interest of the nation necessarily. That invisible hand isn't there anymore. In fact, one place I really agree with Donald Trump is that a lot of American technological firms have did what they had to do for their own sake, but they indeed helped perhaps China and others more than America. Silicon Valley became at some point the spy net all kinds of technologies that were built were easily went to outside the country, spilled over, and yet Chinese controlled there. Whatever that they wanted, they took, and whatever they didn't want, they did not. They don't allow Google in China. They developed their own intranet, but they took the science and technology big time. So we produce for the world, Chinese produce for themselves. And that's the problem. We began talking about globalization, and we cheered globalization, but it was the wrong cheering. We became even the cheerleader of globalization at our expense. America became America because it was local. What made America America was its localization, not globalization. Globalization didn't help America. It hurt America. It continues to hurt America. I'm not surprised that nationalism is growing big time in this country. I am concerned about not just nationalism, but national fascism. Given what's happening to American capitalism and way of life, and the fact that 30-some million Americans now out of job, that 5% of the population owns over 70% of the wealth in this country, and the rest of it, that's bad news. That's very bad news in a country that used to be the melting pot, but no more is. And that's the problem. America isn't anymore even a melting pot. Everybody in this country lives. There are Arabs, Chinese, Iranians, I don't know, all kinds of nations, Europeans, and they are all looking after their national origin. That's the American problem. That's a huge problem. It is now for no reason that we have such an anti-immigration attitude, sentiment in this country, that anti-globalization sentiment in this country, that we are going to go increasingly toward nationalism, perhaps national fascism, against foreigners. Very dangerous, but unless we solve the problem, we just can't hope it to disappear. That's not going to happen. We are going to face it. America is going to face national fascism soon, and it needs to think about it right now. America is going to become number 2 soon, unless some serious things happen. America may, in 5 years, become number 3. India actually may move ahead of America economically. Would be China, India, and then America. That's, even Brazil is a Latin American competitor for us. That's just the fact. The world has changed. So will America change in a way that it will stay number 1 and a global player, but also at the same time avoid globalization and develop a positive, productive nationalism? I mean positive. I hope so, of course, but I remain concerned. A few things that America may be able to do to prevent this trend in the direction that I think is wrong and reverse it into a right direction. The first thing I wanted to say before I forget is that while I spoke about China, Japan, and India, I haven't talked about Europe. Well, Europe never really became anything after World War II. Again, don't misunderstand me. It's a great continent and it's a powerful economy and all that, but they were never, as a whole, even a serious competition to America. They are not today also a serious competitor to China or to India in the future. But Europeans are thinking hard and loud. This coronavirus really woke them up. Europe really suffered. Again, just like America, Europe, the home of liberal capitalism, has moved in the same almost direction that the US has. And because it was a democratic continent, largely, that it was open and the rest of it, it suffered the most from coronavirus. Although some of the countries in Europe have more control over their nations, but they are no China. They are no Japan even. More liberal, more open, more free trade, more free market, except in a few places. I'm talking about economically. So Europe was like America, and after World War II, it really always stayed in the shadow of America. It was the America that rebuilt Europe after World War II. So I don't believe Europe will be a competitor. Europe doesn't concern me. I believe that continent also will experience a similar trend that we are experiencing in this country toward more state control, less liberalism, less democracy, and the rest of it. Now, so this is the way I see the world today. You have America still number one, you have China number two, you have Japan number three, and then Europe as a whole perhaps number three, Japan number four, but it depends how do you look at it. And then of course India and the rest of it. In post-corona world, I believe the world system, this global community that we are talking about, will experience tremendous changes. China, as I said, could become number one, but America is not going to sit back and see China become number one, and that's where the concern comes. I believe Americans are going to devise all kinds of strategies and policies, economically and politically and militarily, to stay number one. Can they? We will see. They will become more nationalistic, as I said. They will become more state-controlled. I think American federalism and democracy is in danger. I think increasingly big guys in this country are going to increasingly become bigger, more concentrated, and some kind of a creeping socialism will develop here. We are going to become like China. I believe in the next 10 to 20 years, America will be where China is in terms of state control, in terms of democracy, the economic base and the rest of it. Now, one place where I think this competition among nations will make all the difference is, again, in science and technology. I said America advanced all kinds of science and technology, but let it go. And others took it and commercialized it. But I believe Americans are not going to do that anymore. I believe moving forward, Americans are going to be extremely nationalistic about their science and technology. American universities will be watched very closely by spies all over the America. I believe that American technology will not easily leave its borders. I believe tremendous control will be placed on American sciences and technologies moving forward. You know, this was the case back in the 40s, 20s, 30s. Technology was controlled then. And then it started becoming liberal. And I believe we are going back to a controlled system for science and technology. I believe China will do the same, Japan will do the same, Europe will do the same, and Indians and others. So the post-corona world is the world of a few nations that will struggle among themselves for superiority, and they will do everything in their power to develop, advance their science and technology and control them. That's bad news for the world science and technology advancement. Every nation will develop whatever it can, but keep it there. Very little will be moving out. The biggest spy operation in the world will be industrial, technological, and scientific spy operations in the foreseeable future, particularly in America, as well as in China and others. China already is of that sort of pathway. China hardly has allowed its technology and science to move just freely out. It has just taken in. So there will be tremendous technological and scientific competition among nations, but this scientific and technological competition will be national and local, as opposed to a global competition. Every nation has its own border for that. We will have an isolated states of a global society very soon. I believe a few countries will survive this competition, certainly America, China, Japan, Europe, India, Brazil, and a few others. I believe a series of other countries, these will become probably, first-rate nations. Again, first-rate in terms of like technological and economic and so on development. And then there will be a second-rate nations that sort of like that will be built around this first-rate nations. And then there will be the third, the switched off, so-called. A lot of nations today that really may have been emerging or are not developed or are suffering, I believe they will never really rise up again. They will increasingly go down the drain. I fear for those nations. So you will have a world of extremely poor, switched off nations that hardly anybody takes into account. And then the second-rate nations that will stand in the middle, and then, of course, the first-rate. This is very much the situation of this center-periphery and semi-periphery sort of theory. But this is really what I am saying has very little to do with that world system perspective. I am not talking about center periphery and semi-periphery. I am talking about here a few centers and a few semi-periphery and many, many peripheries. This center is not one center. In the world system, the center was capitalism. It was the system controlling everything. Now that system is going to be divided into subsectors. It would be the Japanese, the American, the European, the Chinese, the Indians, and so on sectors. And they will not be interacting that much. They will be competing, but competing not perhaps among themselves, the centers, but with others, destroying them even further. Now, I wanted to finish this and continue the next time, but let me conclude. What I see in the post-corona in the United States, and I call it post-corona capitalism, is a capitalism that very much increasingly will resemble to socialist capitalism or social capitalism, very much similar to China in many respects. I believe American democratic institutions are in danger, and for good reason. They just have to make changes. Otherwise, they will be taken over and taken advantage of, and the American way of life will be jeopardized. This is a very tough global situation. The one thing that isn't there is humanity. There is no humanity here. There is no human rights here. There is no liberalism, democracy, federalism, and governance, and that kind of stuff. It's all about control from the top. It's all about the bigger ones becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and the smaller ones becoming smaller and smaller until they disappear. Even in the last few months of this corona situation, American billionaires have become more billionaires. American billionaires have made more money during the corona time that they made before corona. But then American working people and the middle class have suffered tremendously. And yet this is the beginning of a major change. America, in fact, may need soon to introduce something that we know as New Deal of the Great Depression. I'm sure the system is going to resist, but there will be, sooner or later in this country, a great New Deal, much bigger than the previous New Deal, and it has to be. But then a New Deal that will be controlled from the top by a few in political and economic system, with the majority suffering and disappearing, and those majority is going to be given that great deal so then the social order, the political order can be maintained. I will try to see if I can advance this in the next discussion and see if I can conclude about how America's foreign policy may sort of evolve on the